Happy afternoon. I hope everyone's having a great show so far. I know that the reason you come to ICAST is to sit through an hour-long seminar on trade and tariffs. I know that's every little kid's dream, is to be able to come to the world's largest fishing tackle trade show to hear about tariffs. But obviously it's a huge hot-button issue that's impacting really every segment, not only of our industry, but really across the board. You know, I work in Washington, D.C., representing ASA on government affairs issues. And every congressional office I go in and speak to about tariffs, they kind of roll their eyes because that's typically all they hear about all day, all the time, from just about every affected industry. It's really taken up so much of the bandwidth at the federal level. And what's made it so challenging, I know for everyone in the industry, as well as us as an association looking out for your interests, is one, trying to keep up with how quickly things are changing. I was going to say evolving, maybe devolving is the better word to use, because it's just been such a chaotic process to keep up with, of rates changing so quickly, tentative deals being announced, and then the details come out and the details don't match what was in the announcement, or an announcement's made, but those details don't exist, and ambiguity around that makes it difficult for importers, brokers, everyone to understand how do you comply, and how do you know what's coming in the future. I think that's secondly the most biggest challenge that folks are dealing with, is the unpredictability. Whatever the rates are going to be, just tell us what they are and we'll figure out how to adjust. But not knowing, you know, what we're dealing with now is that what's going to be in place in a week, 2 weeks, a few months from now. Is a 90-day pause really a 90-day pause? Is there going to be an extension on that? Is there going to be a deal announced? The unpredictability, I think, is what has so many people frustrated and unsure of how to proceed. Because I think we all can sort of see the writing on the wall, what's happening with China and potentially other countries, but where do you go? How do you shift your supply to feel like you've got some certainty in operating your business, not only in the next few weeks, but well into the future? So we at ASA have been doing our best to help you all understand what's changing, what the rates are going to be, provide a little bit of certainty of looking into the crystal ball of what might be happening, but we don't have the answers, and if someone is smart and who's living and breathing this stuff as much as Ron Sirini doesn't have the answers either, then you know that no one really has the answers, because we're all sort of flying by the seat of our pants. But we're very fortunate at ASA that as of last fall, we began working with Ron and his firm, Sirini Salmon Associates, who are trade experts, consultants that he's got a wonderful team that's helped ASA navigate this process, helped at a macro level in understanding what's happening, rate changes, announcements, but as well as at an individual ASA member level, helping folks, you know, look at the forms that they're getting back from the brokers, how to properly calculate rates, how to look at your supply chain for resilience. They're a huge asset that I hope folks are taking advantage of. I know I've heard from more members over this issue over the last 6 months than I have heard from others over the 16 years before that. Obviously, this is a huge hot button issue for folks. So I don't know that we're going to solve it all today. Maybe Ron will come up and tell me that there was a Truth Social post that announced all the tariffs are off. We'll find out. Probably not. But hopefully provide a little bit more clarity of what's happening, what's to come, and hopefully before long we have a little bit more of a clear picture in place of what this is going to look like, and ultimately how we as an industry start to adjust. So with that, Ron, I'll welcome you up to the stage. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And clearly you missed the post. The president just announced tariffs are gone on August 1st. So everyone, we can end this session, go have a beer. No, I wish that were the case. So I've been working in international trade for over 30 years. And so I've seen a lot of change, and we've been through protectionist periods before. You know I worked for presidents probably before many of you were born. Ronald Reagan. I had the honor of working for President Reagan and for President Bush 41. Both presidents cared a lot about trade. Neither one of them really liked tariffs. When President Reagan did, kind of a la Trump at the beginning of his administration, he did use tariffs as leverage to save certain sectors of the U.S. economy and certain companies. I don't think Harley-Davidson would have survived if President Reagan didn't put tariffs on motorcycles back in the 80s. Our semiconductor industry was on the ropes till the president used, at the time, Section 301, which was a provision of law that was used during the first Trump administration. But we now have a president that truly does believe tariffs is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. And it's like people scratch their heads in Congress. We'll talk to members of Congress, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which has responsibility for both taxes and trade. And he tells us frequently, I call the president, I talk to him weekly. I want to talk to him about taxes, and he doesn't want to talk about taxes. He just assumed we'll get the tax bill done, which they did. You all heard about the big, beautiful bill. And all he wants to talk about is tariffs. So we knew from election day, from what the president-elect was saying, we were going to have a wild ride on tariffs. What really made me understand the magnitude is when the president, his first U.S. trade representative was a gentleman by the name of Bob Lighthizer, a real trade hawk. And he was one to use leverage in an unprecedented way during the first Trump administration. When the president tweeted that Bob would not be coming back to the cabinet because he was too timid, we knew it was going to be quite a ride. So I hope I can answer some questions. There's a lot of misinformation out there about the tariffs. Not many of the major publications get it right. Everyone's trying to cover trade. When I was in the government previously, you could rarely get a Wall Street Journal or New York Times or Washington Post article to cover trade. Now they're all very eager to cover trade. They just don't always get the facts right. So I'm going to delve into a little bit about where we are. And again, please love to make this interactive. If you have questions, please ask questions as we go along. I thought I would start by talking about an issue that's obviously related to tariffs, but not the tariff issues themselves. It's something called de minimis. Does anyone here know what de minimis is? Use de minimis? You know, it's fascinating to me that the politics on the de minimis issue have changed more rapidly than any issue I've ever seen on trade. And this industry has been highly affected by de minimis, and most people didn't even know it existed. So what de minimis entry allowed, up until a few months ago, it allowed goods to be sent directly from China or Indonesia or Vietnam. They could pass through Mexico and Canada and sit in a warehouse and then go directly to the U.S. consumer paying no tax, no duties, no 301 tariffs, no IEPA tariffs, completely duty-free. And I can tell you it's had an enormous impact on a lot of businesses in this industry and other related industries. Because if you can imagine, if you can send directly from your factory or warehouse in China and not have to pay, at one point we were up to 145% tariffs on China, now down into the 50s, but you as the US brand selling to consumers has to pay that, it automatically gives a 50% advantage to those that were using de minimis entry. So President Trump took administrative action to terminate de minimis entry with China only, and that was effective on May 2nd. And that's already started reverberating through the market. So I think, you know, I know some folks have said if you go on the Amazon or Temu, Shein, you still see fairly low prices, but they are starting to go up. And I've talked to several people here at the show that said they've seen a very positive impact on their business since de minimis has ended with China. But the rest of the world can still use de minimis. So as you might expect, suppliers in Vietnam and suppliers in all over the world are starting to use de minimis entry to come into the United States. And there's been a great concern from the White House that products that are coming in labeled made in Vietnam are actually made in China, and that's starting to get scrutiny. So in what the president called the big, beautiful bill that passed Congress was largely a tax bill. That bill does include a provision to end de minimis entry for all countries on July 1st, 2027. So there's a 2-year transition. And that transition is necessary really for two reasons. One is U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which is already overwhelmed by numerous things that are going on. Enforcement of the Uyghur forced labor provision, which affects apparel and other products, but even it's going to start affecting, I think, this industry. And all the high tariffs and changes in the tariff rate. So they're overwhelmed. So they need that time to program their computers. But starting, again, on July 1st, 2027, unless the president acts before then, which he does have executive authority to change it and make it sooner, it will go away in July. So I think that's something that, again, even if you weren't aware of it and you weren't using it, certainly, I think you'll start seeing some positive aspects to your business. So let's start talking about the tariffs. And I'm sure, if you're an importer, you know the tariffs. But there's a lot of things that you're going to need to know as these tariff deals are being announced. So there actually were 3 agreements announced. First, the United Kingdom agreement, probably not major impact on your business. Second was Vietnam. The president announced that there was going to be a deal on Vietnam. The U.S. Trade Representative reached agreement with Vietnam. And then when the president looked at the fine print, he said, not good enough, go back to the negotiating table. So the negotiations are still going on with Vietnam. The most recent deal announced, which was just, I think, yesterday, maybe the day before, was with Indonesia. And the agreement sets now a floor tariff of 19%. The kind of placeholder tariff was 10%. That was supposed to last till July 1st and then extended to August 1st. But as you know, on what the president called Liberation Day on April 2nd, he announced significantly higher tariffs on most countries, and 30, 40, 50, 60% or higher. We do not yet have details on the fine print of these agreements. And something you're going to have to be aware of is the president in each of his announcements has talked about we need to curtail transshipment. So he said the 19%, of course, that will be for products, but we don't know what the rules of origin are. The rules of origin are not going to be the normal rules of origin you use today, what we call substantial transformation. So if you're making a product in Vietnam using a high degree of Chinese components, that may not get the 19%. That may get the 40%. So even the U.S. Trade Representative, I don't think is clear yet what the president's going to decide on what the transshipment level is. But what it means is if you have a product that's legally made in Vietnam, but uses, let's say, more than 50% Chinese content, that will be subject to the higher 40% tariff rate. So that's going to get fairly complicated. Again, there's not much guidance we can yet give on it because there are several provisions of trade law that have value concepts to it, but they're all different. And you'd think that should be a pretty straightforward thing, but it's not. And so we'll have to see, but that could be very, very restrictive. And so for those of you that have worked hard to move to Vietnam, Cambodia, or another supplier, it still might be subject to a pretty high tariff rate. So, Mike will be notifying everyone as we get certainty and we know the details. So, you'll know almost immediately. But I would guess it's going to be another 30 days before we know, because the president still wants to get the Vietnamese agreement wrapped up and then work with some other major trading partners. When the president announced that and started sending these letters to countries, yes? Yeah, sorry, I can't hear.
So would the value of like the transship determination be monetary value of the goods from China in the product, or like the consumption, the weight of the product goods, or the I guess the dimension or
Right.
the amount of use?
Yeah, I think it's almost certainly going to be the value. But again, value gets calculated in a different way. So let me give you an example. Some of you may do backpacks or travel goods and bags, right? And those were added to the U.S. Generalized System of Preference program in 2016. So if you were manufacturing in a GSP eligible country, you would get zero duties, even though the normal duty might be 17.5%, 8%. That has a 35% value rule, but it's calculated extremely liberally. So if you take Chinese fabric, you bring it into Philippines, which is a GSP eligible country, and you cut the fabric into shape, according to CBP, you've created a new component that's considered the Philippines, and therefore that entire value is considered within that 35%, even though the fabrics were made in China. They're not likely to do that. The Trump administration has said repeatedly, the GSP program's been expired for 4 years now. We're hopeful we get that extended in the fall, but they have made clear if it gets extended, they want to have more stringent value rules. There are other programs, probably not many of you use it, the Haiti Help Hope program, which has a value rule to it too. In that program, you actually have to take out and calculate each component and then and so if you bring in, let's say, Chinese sewing thread or Chinese yarn, and you knit it in Vietnam, and then you send it to Haiti for cut and sew, you're no longer, they do not consider that creating a component like they would have under GSP. So you have to know the value of your yarn, you have to know the value of the fabric, and my guess is it's going to be something very similar to that. So not weight, it will be based on value. And the big question for me, if you're doing, in the apparel, let's say you're making apparel, a shirt, using cotton, the Chinese still use a fair amount of U.S. cotton. So if you spin the yarn in China and you're using U.S. cotton, will the rules allow you to include that American value and not consider it Chinese? So again, very complex. I wish I had answers for you other than a pretty high degree of certainty. It will be value, not by weight. Any other questions on that? Almost all the negotiations are continuing. We think they'll be next week or the week after. It's really hard to predict. Again, because the president personally makes these decisions. It's in most administrations, the one I worked for, the U.S. Trade representative generally made the decisions. They sent it on to the president for final approval, and almost always, I know of no example in the Reagan or Bush administration where the president said, no, not good enough, go back and negotiate. And that includes the NAFTA. I was one of the NAFTA negotiators, which, according to our current president, is the worst trade agreement in the history of mankind. I put that on my resume now. I take great pride because I actually think it was a very, very good agreement. But this president will make every single decision. He not only makes the decision on the percentage tariffs he wants, he makes a decision on what order USTR can negotiate with. He makes the decision on what order the agreements will be announced. Because I believe there's been about 15 agreements reached weeks ago with smaller countries that the president has not wanted to announce. So I believe we have agreements already with the Caribbean and Central American countries. I know some people in the fishing industry use Guatemala. I think that there is an agreement, and I think that will be one of the better agreements and probably not have any reciprocal tariffs. But if you look at the list here, You know, a lot of the countries that are where people moving out of China have been going, Cambodia, Thailand, Bangladesh, Malaysia, et cetera, pretty high tariffs if they don't reach a deal. And each of these negotiations are at various stages. And you get, again, a lot of rumor in the press. There's been substantial press that the U.S. and Bangladesh, for example, are very close to announcing a deal. Well, last Friday, I got a call from the minister from Bangladesh. He was just about ready. He's going to leave Washington the next day, and he told me they haven't even put a proposal on the table. The U.S. has not made a proposal to them. So it's really, and what I stress to that minister is it's incumbent on the exporting countries, if they want a deal, they need to be proactive and offer the first deal, you know, the first proposal. And it's difficult because the U.S. is now wanting substantial concessions without giving anything. I mean, it's pretty mind-boggling. I think back to when we were negotiating free trade agreements like NAFTA, we would agree to mutually reduce our barriers and we would give equal and access to each other's market. What President Trump is doing is saying, okay, I want 0 tariffs in your country for U.S. products. I want you to agree to buy 50 Boeing jets. I want you to agree to buy $10 billion of agriculture. And in exchange, I'm going to give you a 19 or 20% tariff. And it's so far seems to me working. The reaction among exporting countries has been interesting because pretty much everyone said that I've talked to, and I won't mention country names, but they've said, as long as we have lower tariffs than China, we're fine. Charge us 20%. Just charge China 50 or 60%. And that's kind of the attitude. So the negotiations are going to continue. I think by August 1st, we'll have announcements on more of the major countries. But again, these things are so complex, I could see that extended another month. So we will have to see. The other thing that I think confuses a lot of people is there's different pillars of tariffs. You just hear the press talk about tariffs and as if it's one thing. So in addition to I call reciprocal tariffs, or the president, the tariffs that he imposed under the IEEPA, Emergency Act Authority, those are what's being negotiated by USTR and by the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of Commerce. But there's a whole series of Section 232 national security investigations going on that have resulted in high tariffs in certain sectors and will result in high tariffs for the investigations not complete. So they're all listed here. I see a lot of you taking pictures, Mike. I don't know if we can make this available. Happy to do that. Steel and aluminum, that's already been announced. A lot of you are painfully working through how the tariffs are structured because look, steel and aluminum, for example, it's not just raw steel and aluminum imports. It includes derivatives. And there also is a process that allows if a product that contains any steel and aluminum, but not subject to a tariff today, a U.S. manufacturer can petition to include that product. So more products can be added to the steel and aluminum derivative tariffs. So we recently have seen those announced. Semiconductors has been going on for a long time. Wood and wood products. I think need to double check this, but I think cork, for example, is technically under the scope of that wood and wood products investigation. I know the Commerce Department hasn't completed the investigation, and the decision for the president to make is on his desk. So they've given the president several options for him to choose how he wants to proceed. But we'll see, and that's going to tell us a lot. There's a lot of wood, exotic woods that are imported to the U.S. They're not grown here, never will be grown here, but we'll see if the president decides to exempt them from the tariffs. These are the sectors, again, where the president really wants to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. He believes Wood products, we can bring furniture manufacturing back. He wants semiconductors made in the U.S. And he wants derivatives. And that's the other thing on the semiconductor derivative. You know, if you have see a lot of electronic components here. They all have semiconductors. They all could be subject to the Section 232 tariff. So we got to watch that very closely. I've already talked mostly about this. I guess the thing I would really stress is tariff fatigue is starting to sit in the U.S. Congress. You're not hearing a lot of Republicans publicly criticizing what the president's doing on tariffs, but a heck of a lot of them are criticizing the president behind the scenes and directly to him. And I know that they've warned the Trump administration that if there's no certainty in the U.S. market by, the end of the first quarter of next year, he's playing with fire politically. Republicans will lose the House of Representatives. The president's not going to want to be impeached. He will be impeached almost certainly if Democrats take control of the House. Senate, under normal circumstances, Republicans would probably pick up 2 or 3 seats in the Senate. If the tariffs stay as unpredictable as they are today, Republicans likely to lose the United States Senate. And I say this because there's no voice too small. If you're being impacted negatively by the tariffs, speak up. Speak up through ASA, or speak up on your own. But Congress is starting to listen. So, I know it's hard to believe. Everyone says, well, when are we going to have certainty? When are we going to have stability? I do think that there will be predictability with most countries. The only exception may be China, but I even think with China, by the time we get to the first quarter, second quarter of next year, the markets will settle down. The president will know where things stand for the foreseeable future. But, all these tariffs that the president's imposing, he's doing through authorities granted to him by the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Constitution gives Congress the right to regulate trade, not the President of the United States. And so I know there's a lot of folks considering, well, given the way the President's used his tariff authority, we're going to need to clarify the authorities that are granted to him. So I do think as we get again into 2026, close to the midterm elections, people are going to be giving serious thought to what legislative action might be necessary to create predictability. And again, I can't stress enough, talk to your congressmen, talk to your senators. If you like the tariffs, let them know that. If you don't like them, let them know that. But as a traditional Republican who worked for Republican presidents, the one thing we always prized was predictability and certainty and less regulation for the U.S. business community. I think we thrived and benefited as a nation because of that. That's changed. And the momentum will swing back the other way. I guess the last thing I would say, some of you have met that there's lawsuits out there. The president's been sued. He's even been sued on or the administration's been sued on the Section 301 tariffs that were instituted in the first Trump administration, and they still continue. That lawsuit's been going on for 5 years, and I'd have to, I'm not a lawyer, but with the lawyers I've consulted, I would think the president will win that lawsuit. But the Emergency Act tariffs are going to go to the Supreme Court. They lost by unanimous vote. There were 3 judges in the Court of International Trade that reviewed what we call the IEPA, the Emergency Act tariffs, and said they were illegal. The president exceeded his authority. It was stunning to me because I know some of the judges, and one of the judges that came to that conclusion is an arch protectionist, worked mostly with Democrat member of Congress. He was the general counsel in the Obama administration, and he was such a protectionist, the Trump administration kept him on for a good part of their first term. So if a judge like that rules that the president exceeded his authority, you know, that lawsuit probably has a chance. The lawsuit was divided into two parts, really. It was the president used an emergency act authority to impose 20% tariffs on Canada and Mexico because of the fentanyl trade, and 10% tariffs on China, or the other way around, I think. Yeah, 20% on China for sure. And the court was clear that tariffs are not a remedy. That's not a national emergency that Congress contemplated when he gave him the authorities. And so I think that 20% part of the tariff could go away even before the end of the lawsuit, because I know that the administration's engaged with China about cooperative measures to curtail the fentanyl trade. So that one has, I think, a better chance of going away sooner rather than later. But we're going to have to see how this lawsuit plays out. I mean, you can't go to the bank on it, but you need to watch it. And I think when the president announced a week ago or 2 weeks ago he's going to impose a 50% tariff on Brazil because he does not like the fact that the former president is being prosecuted through the Brazilian courts. I'd be shocked if the Supreme Court would rule that that would be contemplated and legal under the use of the IEPA authority. So he's very emboldened right now. My guess is he'll pull back on those Brazilian tariffs. And that was sad because I know one company that moved in a very large retailer of footwear, moved all their footwear production out of China to Brazil, and then they found out, well, maybe the tariffs are going to be higher in Brazil. So again, a long way of saying the unpredictability has to come to an end, and it will come to an end faster if everyone affected by these tariffs speak loud and clear. So with that, let me open it up to questions. Or Mike, anything else you think I should cover? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dave Sirini with Fishing FX. My question is, does the tariff take effect on the payment, at the moment of payment, or at the moment of shipment, or the moment of arrival?
So tariffs are assessed always about on the date of importation. But a lot of the tariffs have a bit of a transition clause, meaning if let's say a new tariff comes into effect on August 1st. What the president has done pretty consistently said if it's on a boat, on the final mode of transportation to the U.S., that's not covered by the tariff. So they've given those products, in other words, they're basically a grandfather clause for things that have just been put on a boat or a vessel or on an air carrier to the U.S., and then they've usually been given another like 3 or 4 weeks. So if it's August 1st, let's say the tariff comes in, it was put on a plane on July 31st or a boat July 31st, you can enter it under the lower tariff rate for a given period of time. It can't be for 6 months. Again, it's usually for 3 or 4 weeks, but it's definitely by date of import. But that's been a big issue for a lot of companies, right? So a lot of companies have put, I don't know if you're familiar with what a U.S. Foreign trade zone is. A lot of companies have foreign trade zones. They set them up in the United States. Goods get imported into the foreign trade zone that's not being entered into the commerce of the U.S. Those goods are still considered in foreign status. So traditionally, you could bring goods in and then wait and then see if the tariffs go down. You enter the goods into the United States at the lower tariff rate. The president's changed that in his executive orders. He basically said, you're going to get charged the tariff the date the good went into the foreign trade zone. So there are a lot of poor companies that brought goods into the foreign trade zone when tariffs were 145%. Now they're down to 50% with China. They still have to pay the 145%. So the details to those rules are really, really important. And, you know, the way a lot of, but that doesn't apply if you put it in a bonded warehouse. So again, it gets very complicated. But I think for those of you that need to look at ways to mitigate your tariff exposure in terms of what's in your control, something called first sale, which is a way to set up a transaction. So if there's a middleman, so you have a good produced in China that's sold to a middleman in Singapore or Hong Kong, and then that middleman sells to the US, you can lower your tariff exposure about 20% because you only need to include the cost of the first sale. So what people do is they structure their transactions so that the overhead and many things are included in the second transaction. So again, it's worth looking at. I'm not a lawyer. You need a lawyer, I think, to advise you. We can always recommend someone, but that's something more and more small companies are doing. It's something until recently all the big guys would use. If you're an apparel company, footwear company that has tariffs, normal tariffs of 37.5% or 32%, it was a big deal. First sale is a big deal for them. Small companies never really had to think about using it, but now with the tariff structure we have to do, it is economical to look at those kind of things. Or putting goods in a bonded warehouse, because if you put a good in a bonded warehouse and tariffs go down, you can take advantage of that lower tariff rate.
You've got a term up there called value, and you use the term cost. If you're bringing something into the U.S., it's 50% of a number, 50% of the duty increase to 50%. Who determines what the value of that widget is? In other words, if the country that made it, China, Vietnam, whoever, says, well, this is only worth $1, and they transfer it to me or sell it to me for $1, but it's really worth $6 in the U.S. market.
Right. The burden's going to be on the importer. So you're going to have to work with your suppliers to provide you the cost structure of all your components. Again, we're going to need to wait till the Federal Register is published, and it will give us guidance on what to do. And another thing that the administration's been doing, Vietnam, we know, has already agreed to this. So they're going to partially put the burden on the exporting countries. So Vietnam's going to be required to have a certificate for your shipment to say, we, Vietnam, have determined, you know, we believe the value is, let's say, 70% Vietnamese and therefore subject to the 20% tariff or whatever it turns out to be. But CBP can question that, right? And they're not going to have the resources to review a high volume of shipments, but they will do spot checks. Once they do that, again, it will be like the Uyghur forced labor provision. Again, it was astounding to me, the Uyghur forced labor bill passed in the Biden administration, but driven by Republicans and Democrats. It's the first law I ever remember that concluded you are guilty until you're proven innocent. So if you bring in a shipment, t-shirt, and CBP believes, and they don't have to tell you why they believe it, if they believe there was Uyghur cotton from the Xinjiang region of China in that t-shirt, they stop it. And you cannot get it released until you prove to them it's not in there. And so most companies, until recently, just didn't have the knowledge. Like you said, you don't know that. You place an order in Vietnam, and sometimes you nominate the fabric, sometimes you don't. But you don't usually know where the cotton's coming from. The whole world's changed, and there's going to be more and more burdens like that placed on importers. And again, it falls especially hard on small companies. Any other questions?
Does anybody else have a question for Ron?
Ron, you mentioned tariff risking or minimizing your tariff risk. Ways to mitigate that. So the example you used of the apparel company that had production in China moved to Brazil and sort of frying pan into the fire. So for a company that is primarily or exclusively bringing material in from China, what type of recommendations would you give? I mean, it's frustrating to hear from the administration, well, if you make your stuff in the U.S., you don't have to worry about tariffs. Okay, well, yeah, easier said than done. So what do you recommend companies do that see the writing on the wall, China bad, got to look for somewhere else, but I don't know safe places? Do you recommend diversifying, nearshoring? Like, how do you recommend a company proceed? And okay, we know we need to get out of China, but what's next?
Well, great question, and diversification of your supply chain is really, really important. I hesitate to mention this, but this has been told to us and some companies by Trump administration officials. They firmly believe China's going to go into Taiwan in 2027. And so they are telling companies that you need to diversify your supply chains. You need to have a supply chain in this hemisphere, and you need to have a supply chain in India, something that avoids the South China Sea. I'm not predicting that. I'm just telling you what folks in the administration have said to us. But regardless, I think diversification of supply chain is critically important. But again, that's easier said than done, right? Because if you make, again, using apparel as the example, so many technical fabrics are made in China. Some only in China. Maybe Taiwan makes some, maybe Korea makes some, but only in China. So what has to happen, I believe the next phase, it's going to be incumbent on the U.S. Congress to develop mechanisms to help companies diversify their supply chains. Incentives to nearshore, incentives to friendshore, but it has to happen. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Well, I'd be curious, 2027 is not that far off. As you mentioned earlier, Congress hasn't shown much appetite to engage in this, very deferential to what the president's doing. But do you see, not necessarily them mucking around with the president's authority on tariffs, but to that point, helping take action to help with businesses that need to make those transitions? And what would you see that congressional action looking like?
Yeah,
incentives, tax breaks, what?
I think both can happen. I think tax breaks and even grants and providing insurance like through OPIC and others, risk insurance, et cetera. I think that's going to all be on the table. So Senators Cassidy of Louisiana and Bennett, a Democrat from Colorado, have legislation called the Americas Act. They introduced it last Congress. It didn't go anywhere, and they will introduce it in this very shortly. I think that going into 2026 will have a lot of opportunity. But I also think, this is a bold prediction, but I think the administration's going to have to consider some type of exclusion process for some products from China. I mean, it's just, there's too many small businesses that aren't able to move out of China. They don't have the leverage. No matter what you say about China, they're pretty darn good manufacturers, and they're really good at doing small runs and accommodating the needs of small business. It's really hard to find that in Vietnam and other countries. So I think the economic reality is going to be that we're going to need to have a combination of both. Okay, for some things we're going to need to have legislation like the Americas Act to provide those tax incentives. That's really the only thing they can do. As I said, maybe in some cases grants, but there's going to have to be an exclusion process.